prosecuted, so that we can see maybe usury in the context of a wider bending, if you will, of canon law in everyday society. Just if there's any reaction to that.
Professor Tierney, you want to respond on that?
I truly don't know what the question was.
Could you just repeat it briefly?
I'm sorry.
It's just a sort of an acoustic problem.
Oh, okay. Unless I go and speak. Could I speak to the question? Is my head?
Oh, okay. The question was just in the broader context of condemned or accepted behaviors, where can we place usury, seeing it not as an exception, but maybe looking at it as one of several accommodations, where canon law was bent within the everyday civic behavior or other behaviors of the time. Just as today we have many laws that we do not prosecute.
They developed that sort of argument in making the argument I mentioned about permitting a lesser evil. And there are all sorts of examples. For instance, a very commonly discussed one was the matter of divorce, which was permitted in Deuteronomy, but which medieval people thought was very sinful. And the answer there is not answer, but it goes back to the church fathers and was endlessly repeated in the Middle Ages, that divorce was tolerated to avoid the greater evil of homicide. Because if a man couldn't divorce his wife, he might offer. It sounds almost comical to us, but it's very seriously discussed. Another question that was very much, well, just to give simple examples, marriage pertains to natural law, but in this case it was permitted, of course, not commanded. Otherwise we should all sin if we didn't take a wife, as one of them said. But marriage was not intrinsically evil, it was good. However, when you get to the remoter regions of sexual ethics, you get into deeper water. Sexual intercourse in marriage, it was more commonly held, without any desire for offspring, and done purely out of desire, was in itself sinful. But there was no punishment for it. And this is, again, things that are, general, lots of things are tolerated for various reasons, but avoiding the greater evil was by far the most common one. In that case, you tolerate that to avoid general fornication and so on and so forth. I think I'll quit at that point.
I would say most of the Ten Commandments.
Well, yeah.
Indeed.
I mean, that's right. I mean, what I'm getting at is we focus on what is prohibited often without recognizing that maybe 9/10 of the time it is actually permitted, which is not unique to usury, but to so many aspects of forbidden behavior because of canon law. And punishment is often not due to law, but maybe to a particular immediate political or personal expediency when it is prosecuted. That would be my take on it.
And adultery.
Yeah. Lots of personal behaviors. Lust, greed.
False witness.
Just a comment. This kind of situation that you describe can be quite dangerous because there can be individual and applications of law that are selective, that indicate prejudice against certain kinds of behavior or even groups. So whereas that flexibility in whether to apply or not apply the law has its merit, it also has this underlying danger of partial, in both senses, application that can then express other needs that are intolerant.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, I'm not giving it merit or dismerit. I'm only stating it, I think, as what I see as historical fact, that that there was imbalance in the way certain crimes were prosecuted.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid point.
Jay, I would like to ask you about one of the manuscript illuminations you showed with the Christian knights killing everyone. And what I was particularly curious about is the flames coming out of their mouths. I'd like to know what the iconography of that is. And the other part of it is one of the knights was riding on a lion rather than a horse. And tell me.
That was actually from an illuminated apocalypse, or it was from an apocalyptic cycle from the Liber Floridus, and I don't. No, I was cheating a bit with it. Most of the manuscript's about the Crusades, and I've partial to that image. It's, I think they're the locusts from Revelation, and they're warriors who ride on horses with, as you spotted, the heads of lions, and they spit poison, which sometimes is flame and sometimes is blood, and they have tails like serpents that bite people and kill them. But they are people doing God's work, because God sends them to wipe out a third of the Earth's population. And looking at that, the first time I saw an illustration of that, I had an epiphany where I thought, that's the Crusaders. This is how they thought of themselves.
I was fascinated how Jay's paper and Ahmed's paper complemented each other, and I'm not obviously into metaphysical philosophy, but I'm fascinated in terms of hearing the descriptions of the Westerner becoming more Eastern. Are there similar episodes where the Easterner becomes more Western in a similar scenario that Jay's story was referencing? Or is that just an apples and oranges kind of question? I was just so fascinated by the transformation of the Western story after a while into assimilation with the Eastern, and toleration of the Eastern kind of principles and ways of life.
Well, if I am to answer, I'm not sure if I have a ready-made answer since I'm not a historian, but so the only I can think of essentially the category of philosophers in the Arab tradition. They will always seen as turning Western in a certain way, and there is a very interesting metaphorical depiction of that in the treatise called Risalat al-Tayr by Avicenna, where he talks about, it's a very interesting, you may call it a philosophical mythology, or it's about, he envisions, it's taken from Plato's Phaedo, the idea of the migration of the souls, but it's the migration from the west to the east, and how that depicted a stage in his life where he was revolting. He was completely westernized under the influence of Aristotle, but then he revolted against Aristotle towards the end of his life, and he wrote after that treatise what is a very interesting book that is unfortunately lost now, that's called Oriental Philosophy, on the beginnings or the foundations of Oriental philosophy. So I think that you are right, that something was happening there. Now politically, I'm not sure to what extent, I assume something like that happened politically, but in intellectual history, definitely, and particularly in the encounter with Greek philosophy, there was so much westernization inside the Muslim world. Yeah, thank you.
Brian, I can understand how Johannes would say that exploiting the poor is a very serious evil, but how could he say that there is no greater evil than exploiting? What about murdering the poor? Was that a common view, that this is the greatest of all evils?
I think it was a very exceptional view indeed. But Johannes did have a sort of argument which he brought in, which I didn't have time to discuss, if I can remember it. He quoted a text from the De Cretales, which in turn quoted Augustine, and which said, in this case, that to lie which was an evil, that to lie was not permitted, even to save the life of a captive, than which there could be no greater good. And Johannes takes it as a sort of model and says, likewise, usury is such a great good that there can be no, it's such a great evil that there can be no greater good to be achieved by it. It is only attempted as an explication. Not very convincing. Usury is not the greatest evil, if it is one at all.
No, I was just pointing out to him where the microphone is to go.
I would like to follow up on that issue with usury. I am only familiar slightly with discussions on usury from the 14th century, and especially with regard to Jews practicing usury. So my question is, in this almost defense or opening up the possibility of usury by Johannes, does he also speak to Jews and the possibility of them practicing usury as sort of a permissible way of making money?
In the text I was discussing, he doesn't mention that issue at all. But of course, it was common practice that Jews were permitted to exercise usury, as we all know, because indeed that's based again on the Old Testament, which forbade them to take usury among themselves, but permitted it to other people. He just didn't advert to it. There are then all kinds of further problems about taxing usurious profits and so on and so forth, which I think you were referring to, but it doesn't come into this text at all.
If I could just add to that, in the 14th and 15th centuries, one of the issues that one finds in the legal literature that I'm going to talk about this afternoon is whether a Jew's contract is valid or a Jew's will is valid if he is a manifest usurer. Not just a usurer, which was permitted, but a manifest usurer. And the lawyers debated this issue. And of course, it's, what does that mean? When do you cross the line to become manifest? Which also has relevance to our arguments about usury today.
Moving forward to you.
No, I'm not going to be talking about usury.
For Professor Rubenstein, we see like an example of a medieval person coming in, tolerating how to tolerate usury. Was there anyone from the Crusader states that came out to say there's a good reason that we should be accepting Eastern customs, Eastern lifestyle? Is there anything like that come out?
I can't think of somebody arguing for it in the abstract, to be honest. There are plenty of examples of it happening, but I can't think of somebody, I can't, can you think of anything, Ed, where somebody says this is when it's permitted to work with Muslims, or? No.
But I would add that the problem of money in Crusade history really needs to be investigated from this perspective, in fact. They were scared as hell of it, and of the moral taint that even handling it. There are problems of raising funds and putting them in chests and guarding them with a Templar in a hospital or in a Cistercian or somebody.
Then Joan V turning up with an axe and cutting it open.
Questions that people ask Innocent III and other folks. How do we deal with this? So it's not, usury is a good question, but there's a bigger question of money.
I just point, there's like a kind of an episode in around 1244 where there's an actual Christian Crusader army aligns itself and fights with another Muslim army against these other kind of Muslims, and it was that instance. So there was and they lost. And there's also about 15 years later, there's another instance where the Crusaders allow a Mamluk army to go through their territory to fight the Mongols. So they were kind of, in that case, there was cooperation. So.
You reminded me of a case, and the details are fuzzy in my head, but where Roger of Antioch allies with some Muslim armies against another Muslim army, which subsequently doesn't invade. So they call off they call it off, and the writer who describes this is very critical of him for having allied with the Muslims. Then later, after the sort of allied armies disband, the invasion happens, and Roger wins. But the writer says the moral of this story is, don't ally with the Muslims because no good will come of it. So it seems like any time anyone dealt with it in the abstract, it was a bad idea. So you permitted it by not seeing it or glossing over it as much as you could.
Of course, that's what Ganelon did in the Song of Roland. He aligned with
Any other questions? I have a question to Ahmed, and of course a little bit the elephant in the room question, and this is you were talking about we were very briefly talking about modern Islamic fundamentalism or so-called fundamentalism, and of course there are modes of explanation why and when things changed, but I'm just wondering how much of that discourse you're describing is actually living in Islamic scholarship today? Is this a strong, important voice?
Well, I think this is a rather difficult question. I mean, there were people who are, the problem with the current, if you want to put it like this, Islamic discourse is that it went through a lot of stages after colonialism, and so it has been heavily ideologized. Oh, I'm looking in the okay, so you are here. I didn't notice. So this is I think is a key problem. So to what extent, not only the discourse on jihad, but other key questions in the Islamic legacy are seen in the way they have crystallized and thought of at the height of Islamic civilization, I think is a very problematic question. So the simple answer to your question, no, I don't think that is very much alive, unfortunately. But I think that there are contemporary tendencies that is going back to this in the work of emerging scholars that are trying to dig beyond the ideological discourse which emerged in the late 19th century and early 20th century under the influence or in reaction to colonialism, and is trying to go beyond it. Because a lot of actually the discourse on jihad right now, for instance, if we take it as an example, is very much colored by ideology and to a great extent even motivated by many Western ideas of revolt and take Marxism, for instance. Marxism heavily influenced the intellectual discourse of the Islamic resurgence movements in the early 19th late 19th, early 20th century. So I hope that responds to your questions.
Not exactly a related note, but I was thinking of it with Marty's question earlier. I guess it is related because it popped into my head as you were talking, Ahmed, is that there, in 1105 there was a Damascene writer named Al-Sulami, and he wrote a treatise called the Book of Jihad.
Of course.
Mm-hmm. And I've only read the parts of it which have been translated into French for obvious reasons, but within that, it's sort of a case like Marty you were talking about, where he's being influenced by Western ideas, because he says in a way that would not be written again until Amin Malouf wrote The Crusades Through Arab Eyes. There is a concerted effort by Westerners to practice jihad against us. And because we have given up the practice of regular jihad, they sensed weakness and they started attacking us first in Italy, then in Spain, and now in Jerusalem. So if we're going to prevail in this conflict, we've got to learn jihad like they've been doing it. And I think he says first we have to, practice the greater jihad, and then we'll be ready for the lesser jihad.
This is what I wanted to. Yeah, I mean, you are right. I mean, but he stresses, at least he's still aware that it's more of a metaphysical. It's still living in him. But as I said, I mean, this is how I ended my talk, that social and economic factors did ultimately affect the discourse on it. But in the early centuries, I think that idea was very clear in the minds of those who were thinking about the meaning between both and how they reflected sort of obverse sides of an subjective inquiry into bringing that, constituting meaning in history. But at least in Sulam's time, he was still aware of the lesser jihad. Now, if you read some of the literature, there isn't even that awareness in the first place. So that is very problematic. Yes, thank you.
Any other questions, contributions? Well, we will have time. We have another long round of discussion at the towards the end of the conference. So letting things settling down during lunch break, you might come back to the papers this morning, and having read most of the papers for this afternoon already, it wonderfully fits together. So we'll probably continue in that spirit. We'll have a lunch break until 2 o'clock. All the speakers and respondents, and of course the Powell family, is welcome to join us to the Tolley building for lunch, and I hope to see you all back at 2 o'clock. I think it's time to start with the second part of our conference. Couple of technical things first. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Humanities Center and, of course, the History Department and also the Department of Religion to support this conference and to make it possible. They greatly contributed to all the funds, all the money we needed. After the conference, I already said that we'll have a wine and cheese here, and once we've drunken all the wine here, everyone is cordially invited to come over to our house to continue celebrating Jim Powell. We have a huge pot of soup, we have salads, we have enough to feed everyone. I have here, for those of you who are by car or by bike, I have here plans of a map where you can find our house. It's on Fellows Avenue, just off Euclid, very close, and I really hope that I see as many as possible of you. Just pick a plan. The books in the back are given to us by the Powell family, and everyone who wants to take one or several, please help yourself. And also the off-prints. This is the off-print collection of Jim Powell, and look through them, and if you find any that interest you, please help yourself. Our first speaker this afternoon is Mary Skinner, who is one of Jim's very early graduate students. So she knew Jim Powell when he was young, and which is for me hardly. It's difficult to imagine, but he must have been young at some point of his life.
I think you look at Michael. They
Yes,
look very much alike,
yes.
because I remember your father young.
Mary is writing a fascinating book about the laity, which never has been really looked at as a group, for a very long stretch of period of, I think about 1,000 years, starting with the year 100 after Christ and moving into the High Middle Ages. And she's going to present us a part of her research on the laity, focusing on the peace councils in the late 10th century. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all very much for coming here today to honor Jim Powell. He and his wife Judy, they used to welcome me to their home many times when I was a graduate student, and he helped me to find my funding a little bit along the lines of what Jim said, how good he was with students, for my first research trip to France. And when I got back with lots of charters and documents, he really pushed me to ask hard questions about them and get them organized. And he always focused on historiography of a particular problem that he or I would be studying. I also want to say just a quick word about another of my favorite professors, Professor Joseph Levine, who died shortly before Jim Powell did. And along the historiography line, he introduced me to the really intriguing problems of Renaissance historiography, sort of the historiography of historiographies. And that was marvelous too. And if I may just thank Giles Constable, who's with us today. When I was working on my dissertation, I went to Boston to do work, and he and Caroline Bynum invited me to sit on a seminar they had at Harvard at that point on the 12th century. So between all of those professors, I got a well-rounded look at the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. I think Jim would be pleased that I'm here today sharing some of my research with you, because Jim, as we have already has been said, was such a model for us all, especially in the way he pushed his research and continued with his fine work right up as long as he could and beyond, as Ed Peters said this morning. I have a few slides. I've got to confess I've never done a PowerPoint, so we're going to try it. I took many of these pictures I was kind of on the pilgrimage route myself a couple of years ago to Conques and Moissac and Poitiers. I've been a number of times, and Rocamadour, which was a wonderful mountain sanctuary, where the Peace of God movement emerged in the 10th century. So the images of the paper are just meant to be enjoyed as background, and I'll change them from time to time. They're mostly within a century or so of the events that I'll be talking about. And I can't go without thanking Albert Dean, too, because he and I have been working for the better part of a year on email almost every day, and he's worked tirelessly to get this conference organized. So I'm going to kind of miss him when we stop planning, which I guess we'll have to do. Whoops. All right. So, lay initiative in the early Peace of God movement. In the 10th century, sometimes known as the Age of Iron, they were inured to violence and very tolerant of war, as indeed we still are today. The early peace movement was a special moment in history when all ranks of society, clerical and lay, felt secure enough to work together through institutional channels and family networks, and by a strong show of power, both social and supernatural, to try to keep war and violence at bay. Beginning in the Auvergne and Aquitaine and spreading through northern France, dukes, counts, and bishops convened councils to promote peace. Abbots and monks brought the relics of the saints, and in elaborate processions, miracles we learn often abounding, and on these relics, clergy, warriors, and peasants alike swore oaths to keep the peace, protect unarmed clergy and peasants, and to respect the property of the church. Monastic historians were often those who channeled and chronicled the events, described the miracles of the saints, and preserved the canons of the peace councils. They interpreted the peace process as part of a reform movement of the church led by monasteries such as Cluny and Fleury. The liberty and independence of the monks and their property, as well as the morality of the clergy, were related concerns. To study the Peace of God movement is to plunge into a historiographical whirlpool, and we're not going to. I'm skipping 6 pages. I think historiography will come into this, but again, it's too detailed, and I have a limited amount of time. I think I'll read this page. The peace movement has continued to intrigue historians of many generations, including those of us who lived through the peace movement of the late 1960s, who are in distinct danger of reading our own experiences of pressuring the U.S. government to end the Vietnam War back into the early Middle Ages. Those were the years that I began my graduate study here at Syracuse University. Can we possibly see this peace movement as it really happened? Wie es eigentlich gewesen, as the ghost of Leopold von Ranke whispers from his nearby archives? Probably not. Every historian wears spectacles, shading his or her own peculiar perspectives, and the chroniclers and participants themselves, our original sources, barely disguise their positions and prejudices. And since perhaps you don't know mine and might not detect them, I will quickly clarify them. I tend to see continuity between late antiquity, the Carolingian world, and the 10th century, including the law, monarchy, civil strife, church traditions, families, classes, and social structures. I do not agree with the mutation of the year 1000 thesis that interprets the peace of God as a reaction to feudal chaos caused by a new class of renegade Castellan knights. Nor do I see the 10th and early 11th centuries as inspired by the ideals of the Gregorian reform movement yet, but rather the early Cluniac and related monastic reforms emanating from the same religious houses that supported the peace of God. However, I do not underestimate the impact of the cult of the saints on laity and clergy, high and low. The saints, in fact, often seem like characters in their own right, in the promotion of peace and the defense of their territories. We know, of course, that the bishops and monks stood firmly behind them, as did the people. Pilgrimages to Rome, Compostela, and Jerusalem, the invention and translation of relics, and the liturgies and processions, either to honor the saints or to castigate the sinners, marked the period of the peace of God as one of religious fervor. Finally, I tend to see the laity, from noble to peasant, not as manipulated by bishops, abbots, or princes, but as fully involved agents, sometimes it's hard to see it, that supported the peace councils as one important means of defending their rights and property and seeing peace and justice in their society. There's our knights. See them pulling each other's beards? War and violence could be kept under control when all worked together. Lay people took initiative, along with bishops and monks, politically, militarily, religiously, socially, in these earliest peace councils. We will first examine an early assembly held near Le Puy in the Auvergne, called by a bishop who was also a count. Now there's an example, if ever, of the blurring of sacred and secular. Then we'll consider the religious and social dimensions of lay participation in the first official council near Poitiers at Charroux in 989 that was mysteriously missing its duke. Finally, we'll look at the Council of Limoges in 994, where the saints were the stars, and its intriguing aftermath. There were many other church councils linked to the peace movement through the mid-11th century, when the movement was changed by the tolerance of limited war into the truce of God. But these 3 early examples will illustrate the dynamics of 10th century French communities that briefly took a stand against local war, injustice, and internal violence. So there's the 3. A placetum was called by Guy of Anjou, who may have been both count and bishop of Limoges, on the field of Saint-Germain-le-Prade near Le Puy in the Auvergne in 978 or 980. Christian Lawrenson Rosaz makes a good argument that the peace movement began in the Auvergne with a series of meetings called by diocesan bishops but attended by the local nobility and monks. The Cartularia of Saint-Chaffre provides our earliest text. And in this, it's a short excerpt really, but I'll just try to summarize it. He ordered all of the knights and the peasants from his diocese that they should gather together so that he might seek their advice on how to assure the peace. But he also took the precaution of asking his nephews to bring up their armies and stand out nearby in Brioude. And he called on all of those who were present in the field to swear an oath of peace, to not oppress the goods of the church, return those they had taken, and he said that was appropriate for faithful Christians. But the people resisted, at least some of them did, we don't know who, so he ordered his army to come up during the night, and then he forced them to submit and compelled them to swear the oath and to return a castle to the cathedral and to give back their lands. The bishop in question had been abbot of a reformed monastery in Cormery before becoming bishop. King Lothair seems to have appointed him as both bishop and count in 975. His sister Adelaide and her sons, who were the ones who came to rescue him, she was the widow of Stephen of Brioude, and she seems to have been definitely behind the scenes in all this. In the 10th century, it was not unknown for abbots as well as bishops to retain private armies. Michel Paris studied the careers of nearly 1,000 bishops, finding that the bishop of the 10th century was still very Carolingian, usually was elected, but also beholden to the lord of the region. He came from the local nobility, just generalizing now, and had been groomed for his position, perhaps by serving as a canon of a local basilica, where he received a pretty good classical education. He was torn between his family interests and those of the church as he tried to kind of consolidate his position, but he took the duty seriously as a pastor, as a preacher, as a sacramental minister. Carolingian bishops had also long been charged by the kings with responsibility for providing charity, settling disputes, and keeping the peace. Bishops of the Reformed party were expected to be monastic in their spirituality, but also capable secular leaders. In the last half of the century, some bishops gained authority and independence, developing creative solutions to conflicts around them, and one example is the Peace of God movement. Paris concludes, as a prince, a prelate needed a constant bodyguard of professional soldiers. Karl Werner adds that a bishop studied the classical texts of warfare, received training in the field under an able commander, and led his own army that he put at the disposal of the king. A recent study, The Bishop Reformed, concludes that most, even progressive bishops, were adept at working their networks and balancing family, ecclesiastical, and political responsibilities. They were not dominated by the leading dukes and counts, but they were certainly in their circle. They cooperated with lay lords, but also began organizing neighboring bishops to work together toward peace and other common goals. They may have learned their trade from their uncles, for they often grew up in their shadows and succeeded them as bishop. The Bishop Reformed book concludes, military capabilities, when used for proper ends, were among the worthy qualities of a bishop. Marcus Bull perceptibly names the violence perpetrated by the nobles, both lay and ecclesiastical, as slow motion abuse. I kind of like that. Legally practiced on those in the Lord's power, and this example of coercion of all of his soldiers and his diocese by Bishop Count Guy seems of that order. Guy's nephews, in serving the authority of the count and the bishop, were threatening legitimate violence in the presumed cause of justice, but violence nonetheless. Lawrence and Rosaz, with some justification, accuses Bishop Guy of Anjou of selling out to feudal interests. Some of the so-called legitimate violence seems to have been directed at recovering church properties. Many had been appropriated by kings and nobles at the time of the Viking Northman invasions in the late 9th and 10th centuries, Saracens and Magyars too for that matter. If noble families did give back some of their contested lands to the church, they were constantly reclaiming them, or at least their revenues that they collected, which in the charters are always called evil customs. There were surely two sides of this story, but Bishop Count Guy was a doubt missing insisting that such claims be settled not by violence but in the courts, his courts to be sure. His methods of intimidation were certainly questionable for a peace council, and he perhaps needed the advice of some of his fellow bishops. Bernard Bachrach has an intriguing solution for the problem, saying that Bishop Guy was not acting as bishop, but as count, which best explains his behavior. He was calling a meeting in his role as count, officially a placitum rather than a synod. To be a proper peace council, a number of bishops needed to be there, and as a count he could levy his military force still in the king's name, and likewise his nephews, but he bound his armed men by a private oath. As count, he was also legally empowered to demand the nephews to call out their forces. He was promoting his family and the needs of the church, but he was also trying to restore peace for the Carolingian monarchy. And as count, that was his primary mission. Bachrach thinks that the finances of count and bishop had been merged by this time, which might explain why the cathedral had a castle at all. As count, Guy's actions would seem more reasonable to us today, I think, than as a bishop, but he probably made no distinction between these two roles. Guy had been actually a monk. He'd been a lay abbot and a warrior, but he had also been a monk of Courmarie and an abbot, so he had both sides and both background. All of the armed men of his diocese, knights on horse and lightly armed peasants, participated in this early peace meeting, some more willingly than others, to be sure, to pledge peace, restore the lands of the church, and reinforce the power of their count, bishop, and king. What can we conclude about this first peace meeting at La Prade in 980? Since it was called by a bishop who was a count, the highest secular and ecclesiastical authority was in charge. The people were invited to attend, or at least the nobles and those peasants who carried arms and were still liable for military service. The policy of coercing resistors with armed force would not be common in later councils until the infamous peace army of the Archbishop of Bourges in 1038, which is commonly thought to end the movement. The goal of La Prade was to end oppression, perhaps taxes and requisitions in lands belonging to the church, and the return of these lands and a castle to the cathedral. La Prade was the first gathering in which those present swore an oath and in which hostages were taken to ensure that promises were kept. What was not done at La Prade is significant as well. There was no mention of monks with relics being present, miracles occurring, or enthusiastic people and crowds calling out for peace. The bishop count is unlikely to have acted alone, but his associates, lay and clerical, were not named. No specific provisions were made for the protection of the poor, and as at later councils. The Council of Charroux opened in 989, convened near Poitiers, and it's often considered the beginning of the peace movement. Both the canons of the council and a description by a contemporary, Lataldus of Missy, have survived. The council is not noted in any of the major chronicles. Charroux was a reformed monastery of considerable reputation, with a relic of the True Cross located close to the capital of Duke William Ironarm, who was surprisingly not in attendance. However, the bishops of Poitiers and Limoges were there as hosts. 4 of the 6 bishops were from the southern archdiocese of Bordeaux, rather than representatives of the Archbishop of Bourges, which was the more local metropolitan. Presiding over the council was Archbishop Gumbald of Bordeaux, who was listed in other documents, sometimes also as Duke of Gascony. It's been a long time, they wrote, since a council had been held, and the bishops and these bishops, as well as clerks and monks, not to mention lay people of both sexes, have beseeched the aid of divine justice to quell criminal activity and replace it with legal action. The canons of the council, and there's a shepherd in the middle there. Can you see that? Be clear on the slides? Okay. There were three, basically, canons. If anyone attacks the Holy Church or takes anything from it and compensation is not provided, let him be anathema. If anyone takes booty from peasants or from the poor, unless it is due to the fault of the victim, and that person neglects to make proper compensation, let him be anathema. And 3, if anyone robs or seizes or strikes a priest or a deacon or any man of the clergy who is not bearing arms, a shield, a sword, a breastplate, or a helmet, but is simply going about his business or remaining at home, and if after examination by his own bishop that person is shown to be guilty of any crime, then he is guilty of sacrilege, and if he further doesn't come forward to make some amends, let him be totally excluded from the Holy Church of God. Commentators have noticed the careful reservation clauses throughout. Someone who's taken church property or revenues can avoid sanctions by repayment. A peasant that complains that his animals have been stolen will be questioned on whether he had protected them adequately. Someone who has had a fight with a cleric can make amends. However, if the sanction of anathema, if applied, was very serious, since it meant not just excommunication, but really a separation from the whole Christian community. Litaldus of Messy described how the monks of Nouillet brought the relics of St. Junium to the Council of Charroux, and some miraculous healings occurred there, and also his account is fairly similar to the Acts, but in more biblical language. For instance, evil people have wasted the vineyard of the Lord. Therefore it pleased the bishops, abbots, and other religious men that a council be held, at which the taking of booty would be prohibited, and the property of the saints, which had been unjustly stolen, would be restored. And then he tells us about a great crowd of people gathered there from Poitou, Limousin, and neighboring regions, and that many bodies of the saints were also brought there, adorned with frequent miracles. So both of these assemblies were called by bishops who held some civil authority, but the Council of Charroux had a more ecclesiastical tone. It dealt with civil as well as ecclesiastical crimes, unless the peasants who were losing their animals were all on church properties, and that seems unlikely. However, the council threatened a socio-spiritual and not military reprisals. Being under an anathema was especially awful if you died, because you might not be buried in consecrated ground or have a funeral mass in the church, and more significantly, unreconciled to the church, you would be damned eternally. It seems to have been a very potent threat, because the canons of Charroux were adopted by several subsequent canons and councils almost verbatim. The absence of the Duke, in the absence of the Duke, there are no attested nobles at Charroux, except as they may have been in the great crowd of many people. Why was Duke William absent from such a significant event right close to his capital, especially since he was in the neighborhood and went to dedicate with the same bishops the monastery church of Malazet right after the council? Several plausible explanations have been given, but I just present one, and that is Claire Taylor's, that the presider Gumbald of Gascony may have opposed Cluniac-style monastic reform. She studied the houses in Gascony itself and concludes that the family was both protecting and plundering the property it had donated, apparently still considering that it was its own to dispose of. How could the Duke, Archbishop of Gascony, call a council but a few miles from the capital of the Duke of Aquitaine without his cooperation? Taylor suggests that the Gascon Duke was extending his power and essentially forcing his way via the church into the territory of his neighboring Duke of Aquitaine. That eventually Aquitaine captured or conquered Gascony, but the balance of power was reversed at this point, and he wanted to protect those churches in Aquitaine as a spiritual guardian, but just as he and his family protected their church in Gascony, not in the way of Cluny and Fleury. Lay princes were deeply implicated in the politics of the peace of God even when they were absent, and William Iron may have boycotted the Council of Charroux in resentment of Gumball's invasion of sorts of his territory. Nevertheless, the crowds, the enthusiasm generated by the relics, the consensus of bishops to bring out the heavy weapons of excommunication and interdict. I've got an armed king here, forgot to change it. That's Herod, but there's an armed king. The consensus of the bishops to bring out the heavy weapons, not only toward those who injured church property, but to the meager, also those that hurt the peasants in their meager livelihood and the poor. Charroux was not only the first, but one of the most successful of the early peace councils. The bishops had discovered a winning combination, and they were on a roll. And the Dukes of Aquitaine also realized the potential of the peace movement for increasing their power, and they were to sponsor a number of different councils in the next few years. Several historians have recently argued that the most important outcome of the early peace councils was to strengthen the authority of the bishops, the dukes, and the counts. If there was an enthusiasm for peace, there was also increased respect for those who enforced it. Taylor observes that the peace movement was sort of hijacked by the legitimate secular authority, especially William V, the next Duke of Aquitaine, William the Great, 995 to 1030. William, who along with his most prominent counts participated fully in the Council of Limoges, the next one, our third one, and molded it with the cooperation of the bishops into an institution of civil justice with courts, judges, and perhaps even lawyers, if that's legis docti, to carry out the mandates of the Duke for the maintenance of the peace. So we turn to our third example, the Council of Limoges in 994, described by the chronicler Adema of Chaban, who celebrates the presence of the saints there. I just should have had a reliquary, but at least that's supposed to be St. Radigan's hermitage. He says that at the time of the council, there was this epidemic ravaging the neighborhood, and it seems to have, he talks about a pestilence of fire, and people were burning up. And that's thought to be St. Anthony's fire or ergotism, probably caused by the rye crop that year. And he says that therefore the abbot and the bishop of Limoges and the abbot of Saint Martial held council with William, Duke of Aquitaine, so there's that consensus thing, and declared a 3-day fast. And then all the bishops came together in Limoges, and the bodies and the relics of the saints were solemnly brought there. And particularly this raised the status of Saint Martial, and that's another story I can't tell today. But Martial, patron of God, was raised up to meet the other saints. Once an enormous joy filled everyone, and all sickness everywhere ceased, so a pact of peace and justice was concluded by the Duke and his lords. The canons of this council are thought to be similar to Charroux. You can find out more about what is probably this council in a foundation charter quite a bit later of Charroux, the miracles of St. Benedict by Andrew of Fleury, and the miracles of St. Vivian of Figeac, all attest to great crowds, processions of relics at a council of Limoges in the late 10th century. The count is clearly in charge, consulting the bishops and abbots on how to end the strange illness. The Duke attended the council and concluded the pact of peace and justice with the assent of his noble lords. According to Landis, this council, and I quote, "This description depicts perhaps the most famous example of a sanctified peace council, that is, one in which large crowds, miracles, and great spiritual enthusiasm played a major role." We know a bit more about this council thanks to the translation of Saint Martial and other writings by Adema, his sermons, although they are somewhat suspect because he was promoting the saint. Duke William attended the council with the subject counts, townsmen, and great men, the optimates under his governance. Perhaps even the Bishop of Bordeaux was there. Adema also wrote of a unanimous wish of all the princes of the kingdom of Aquitaine to obey the episcopal injunctions. A system of courts and judges was established. William V made his mark upon the Duchy of Aquitaine with the help of his natural allies among the senior clergy. Daniel Callahan confirms that William was the first civil ruler to incorporate a peace council into his policies and work creatively with the church for their mutual advantage. Particular dedication to the relics of the saint in Aquitaine in these years is attested by many things: the invention and translation of the relics of saints new and old, the creation of ornate and valuable reliquaries to hold their remains, and the proliferation of sermons, liturgies, tropes, and chants to honor them. Pilgrims crowded the roads to their shrines, and when the saints attended a peace council, such as that of Limoges in 994, the people took notice. When oaths were taken in the presence of these saints, they were considered particularly solemn and inviolable. The fervent loyalty of the people, noble and poor, to the saints and their relics in Aquitaine gave the peace of God there its cutting edge. In conclusion, the peace councils would demand that quarrels be settled by law and not by violence. They restrained the judgment of any one bishop by the voices of his peers. They were more often attended by the count or duke as time went on. However, it was no longer necessary to station an army outside the camp to coerce the oaths of peace. By 1,000, the presence of the duke or count and his entourage and the array of saints and relics would be sanction enough. Reconciliation. And Christ's blessing. Peace I leave you. The church added the spiritual sanctions of excommunication and interdict, but only as a last resort if the accused didn't do penance or make restitution under the pressure of peers, the church and their lords. The laity, aristocrats, and peasants initiated aspects of the peace movement. The peasants, most likely free and not servile yet, retained their rights to carry arms and take oaths. By their very numbers, they could pressure the violators of the peace, or sometimes the organizers. Peace councils were not always peaceful. An altercation at Limoges in 1018 led to many being trampled in the church, or this may have been covered up by Adamer of Chaban, who only says that it was an accident as the crowd rushed the relics. Raoul Glaber pictures the 10th century as one of growth and building, especially of churches. The Cluniac reform movement spread the message of restoration and peace. Counts and dukes assumed the mantle of royal authority and appointed castellans and viscounts to carry out their mission. Bishops who came from the same aristocratic families added their voices and spiritual sanctions to the movement of the peace of God that accompanied the transition from a fragile, loosely organized Carolingian empire toward the principalities that would dominate Western Europe for the next 2 centuries. The early peace of God marked the last stage of the Carolingian cooperation between clergy and laity, powerful and poor, in an effort to govern by combination of spiritual authority and law rather than naked force. And this slide intrigued me. It's sort of a postscript, but there's little hint that I can find yet of the Crusades to come. It's often, the peace movement is said to have been a prelude to the Crusades. Here you have Abraham giving his blessing to both Muslims and Christians at his knee, while he's flanked by 2 rabbis. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for a wonderful paper, and we'll hopefully have a lot of discussion about it later. Our next speaker is Ken Pennington, and I have to... Don't run away, you're still wired. When I... Can you help yourself? Yeah. When I started as assistant professor here at Syracuse University about 6 years ago, I heard a lot of, Ken Pennington was a sort of almost mystical figure for me, because I heard a lot of wonderful Ken Pennington anecdotes and stories, which just made clear to me that he was then and is still dearly missed in Syracuse. So we are especially happy to have him back, and I was very happy to meet him just half a year ago at Catholic University when I gave a paper there. He's a professor at Catholic University, professor in canon law and history. He wrote, I should about 70 articles and numerous books, among them Pope and Bishop, the Papal Monarchy in the 12th and 13th centuries, and The Prince and the Law, 1200 to 1600, Sovereignty and the Rights in the Western Legal Tradition. And today he's talking about the law's violence against medieval and early modern Jews.
Thank you very much, Albrecht. I'm delighted to be back in Syracuse, and after this event, I might beg to come back, because after I die, I'm expecting Albrecht would put on the same show for me that he's putting on for my longtime 30-year colleague, Jim Powell. When I thought about what I could talk about when Albrecht invited me to come, I thought Jim was always interested in minorities, and we've already heard some of the titles that Jim wrote over his long career dealing with minorities. I also thought he was interested in the Crusades and violence, and I also reflected that his lovely, beloved wife Judy was half Jewish. So putting all of that together made me think that doing something on Jews would be appropriate. The other reason I had is I have a PhD student back in Washington who's doing a dissertation on Jews in the legal sources, and I must confess I didn't know a lot about Jews in the legal sources, and I thought I ought to get up to speed so that I could be a decent mentor. In doing so, I always like to give a talk with some illuminations out of medieval manuscripts or sculpture or something that connects with what I'm talking about. And so I did a little bit of research on the illustrations of Jewish people in medieval manuscripts in particular, and you see an example of it here. And I found something just extraordinary that I can't explain at all, but as I go through my illuminations, you might come up with some ideas. I found out that in English manuscripts of the 13th and 14th centuries, that Jews were caricatured in the way that you see them here, caricatured. Going through all the sort of standard literature that exists on Jews in medieval manuscripts, I could find no other part of Europe that did the same thing. Now, we have a very distinguished art historian, and I'm sure she's going to tell me at the end of my talk exactly why that is so, why English manuscripts have so many caricatures of Jews and we don't find them anywhere else. But as when you get bored with me, please look at the screen. Now, I decided after some thought that an interesting topic to discuss would be the forced baptism of Jewish children in the legal literature. And if you reflect for a moment, can any more violent act be done to a family than baptizing their children and dragging them out of the family? No greater violence, I would say, could be done, except perhaps if you killed them. But taking them away from the family is almost like killing them. Now, there are a couple of really important texts that provide the foundation for how the jurists thought about how the Jews ought to be handled in society. Now, I'm not going to talk about too many actual cases in which Jews were handled. I'm going to be talking about the intellectual juristic foundations, but we will touch upon, to a certain extent, as you'll see, actual cases in which Jewish children were taken taken away from their families. But the basic text, actually it's text, but in brevity, I'm just going to show you one, is found in Gratian's Decretum, as you can see by the way, Meredith, part of your job is to read the text on the screen. That the basic text can be found in a book called Gratian's Decretum, which is the first book of canon law that was taught in the law schools. And this text, as you can see, is taken from the Council of Toledo. Gratian put it into his Decretum. And for you legal historians in the crowd, one of the things that I found out in doing this little bit of research was that the text that Gratian put in his Decretum that dealt with Jews, he only put in his Decretum at the very end. There are 3 different recensions of Gratian's Decretum. He probably began putting it together around 1120. He finished in 1140. And all the texts, not just this one, but all the texts, only get into the Decretum at the very end. I can't tell you why. He obviously wasn't terribly interested in the legal status of Jews until the very end of his teaching career. So, as you can see, I don't think I have to read this to you. As you can see, Gratian says 2 things. First, that Jews should not be converted forcibly. But secondly, if they are converted, they have to remain Christian. So this inspired, and again I'm cutting it short for brevity, this inspired further commentary. First of all, what does it mean to convert? And what you see here is a mid-12th century manuscript, and what you should be reading is Ad Sacramentum Salutis Venire. And what this unknown glossator says when he's looking at this text, what does it mean to convert? It means to be baptized. You come to the sacrament of salvation, and that's what it means to convert. So immediately they saw that a forced conversion was a conversion that incorporated the sacrament of baptism. This is the earliest example that I know of waterboarding. The question is, what is the question that the jurist asks? And again, I'm abbreviating. The jurist asks a question, when does a baptism become coerced? And Higuccio was a very famous jurist, the end of the 12th, the beginning of the 13th century, and Higuccio came to the conclusion that you see up on the screen, that if you tie someone down and you pour holy water on him, he becomes a Christian. Excuse me. That is coercion, and at first it's called a conditio absoluta. Later you'll see that the jurists describe this as being a conditio precisa, or an absolutely precise condition. Everything else, and again I'm sparing you from a lot of detail, everything else was okay. Threats, violence, coercion of any sort whatsoever was considered to be conditional, and therefore the sacrament was valid. There were some jurists who even thought that the sacrament was valid, even if it was coerced in the way in which Higuccio describes. Now, what I'm going to be looking at are a group of sources in medieval law that are called concilia. And these are essentially what we would call in modern American common law briefs. And these concilia describe, in many cases, actual court cases. They're responses to either one of the litigants asking for an opinion from a very famous jurist in a particular case, or sometimes the court itself will ask for an opinion. And the jurist made an enormous amount of money by writing these concilia, and the concilia cover an enormous number of different issues. I went through, as you'll see, I went through, perhaps 40 jurists' collection of concilia from the 13th through the 17th century, and these were all the topics that I found which were covered in these concilia. And only one of the topics, as you can see, is the coerced baptism. But what we're going to concentrate on are the coerced baptism. Now, I'm ignoring everything that happened before the concilia because the book that I have on the bottom of the screen gives a very workmanlike coverage of everything up until the age of the great concilia literature of the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, Wally Pachter's medieval canon law. Now, the very first concilium that I found that dealt with the question that I was interested in, but also dealt with a number of other questions, is a concilium that was written in 1281. It was written for a Dominican inquisitor, and the Dominican inquisitor had a number of different questions that he asked. Well, we don't know exactly who wrote this, but he asked the jurists of Padua or the jurists of Bologna to write out a very detailed questionnaire, a brief, on what should be done. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things in this much longer concilium. The first is the legal status of the Jews themselves. They very rarely, the jurists, or in general, very rarely tell you exactly what they think the legal status of the Jews are. And in this case, they make it absolutely clear. The only rights that a Jew has in Christian society is thereby a privilege. And if they abuse that privilege can be taken away. So it explains much. It explains why Jews are not allowed to bring cases in court. They're not allowed to testify in court. They're not allowed to do anything from a legal point of view unless the prince, the government of the city-state, a statute permits them to be able to do that. By the way, Meredith, I found this particularly intriguing because here we have Cain and Abel. And Cain, I don't know what the illuminator was thinking. He suddenly, as he killed Abel, he became a Jew? I don't know. But in any case, you can clearly see which one is Cain and which one is Abel. To go on with this particular concilium, he also deals with the issue, or the jurists deal with the question that the Dominican inquisitor had posed, and that is, what happens if a child is baptized, the father is absent, and what should be done with the child? Now, the reason that the absent father is an important issue is simply because the father has what in Roman law was called the patria potestas. As you'll see, the jurists debated whether in fact a Jew could have patria potestas, but the father has patria potestas, so theoretically nothing should ever be done to a child without the father being present. But in any case, the jurists conclude that if a Jewish child is baptized, that he or she should be taken away from the parents. And this becomes more or less the common opinion in the juridical world for the next couple of centuries. Now, if there's a bête noire, if there's an evil person in the story that I'm telling, unfortunately it's a canonist who's writing at the end of the 13th century. His name, as you can see, is Guido de Basio. And Guido de Basio, for the first time that I can see, at least I haven't discovered anyone else, Guido de Basio puts forward the notion, if the Jews have no legal status in society, they must be, from a legal point of view, like servi, like slaves, who don't have any legal status in society at all. And Guido, again, I'll give you the English here. He argues, first of all, the slaves do not have patria potestas, but that's obvious. That was part of long-standing legal doctrine, but also because they are slaves that Christian princes can do anything that they want to do to Jews, but in particular to Jewish children. And as we'll see in just a moment, this is going to have horrendous ramifications in the 16th century. I find this illumination of marginalia particularly interesting. Again, the Jews, this is a 14th century manuscript, the Jews aren't caricatured, as you can see, but here we have a Brit. This is after the Brits had expelled the Jews, probably. Expelling a Jew with some sort of a weapon in the hand. But the way that you know that they're Jews is twofold. One, the Chronicle is talking about the expulsion of the Jews at this point. And secondly, the symbol that all Jews in England had to wear was a symbol of the Ten Commandments, the two tablets of the Ten Commandments. Now, if there's a hero in my story, again, remember, I'm giving you a very abbreviated version of the story. If there's a hero in my story, it's probably Gaspar Calderini, who's, this will surprise you, a married man. There were, by this time, at the end of the 15th century, there were a number of married jurists. At the end of the 14th century, there were a number of married jurists, but there were also many, many single jurists. This should resonate, I think, just a little bit with problems in today's society or in today's church. But in any case, it's quite obvious that Gaspar Calderini had great misgivings about taking Jewish children away from their families if they had been, for one reason or another, baptized. And so, as you can see, he comes to the conclusion that Jews are not should not be coerced, and it's equally true of children. But if, he doesn't tell us how, if for some reason a Jewish child is baptized, that what the Jewish parents can do is to give a surety, that is to say money, to give money, and that money would secure them their child until the child reaches maturity. And Calderini's, during the 15th century, as far as I can tell, Calderini's opinions carried great weight. However, and I'm getting now into the 16th and 17th century, and those of you who know me know that this isn't my most competent period. I may know what the law says, but I have much less, perhaps, an understanding of the societal context. But in the law, in the concilia of the 16th and 17th century, which are connected with some of the most horrendous anti-Semitic actions by Christian princes that were ever perpetrated in the medieval and early modern period, the jurist wrote a number of concilia dealing with one of those events, and that was an event in Portugal where the King of Portugal in 1497 or 96, 97, he issued an edict which expelled all the Muslims from the Portuguese kingdom, but also he ordered that the Jewish children should all be baptized, and Jewish adults should either be forcibly forced out of the kingdom, or they should be killed, or they should be turned into slaves. And in the 16th century, as far as I can tell, Guido de Basio's idea that Jews have the same legal status as slaves, and therefore, juridically speaking, can be treated as slaves, comes to full fruition in the late 15th and 16th centuries. And then, Meredith. I'm picking on Meredith because she's an art historian. Is this working? Good. What's happening here in this illumination?
I don't want to get into it.
You don't want to get into it. I have not found an art historian, by the way, Meredith, who deals with this particular illumination. In fact, I haven't found any other illumination except in this English manuscript that looks anything like this. Meredith, what this is a circumcision. We know what a circumcision is, right? It's a circumcision, but look at the iconography. You have these lovely Christian boys. Now this is, again, it's not, I would love to be able to get into it, but there were many myths circulating in the medieval and in the early modern period, and extending up until the 18th and 19th centuries, that Jews would commit ritual circumcisions and also ritual murders on innocent Christian boys. And what you see is, I think, if my iconography is not completely wrong-headed, what you see are these lovely Christian boys, this caricatured Jew with a knife circumcising those Christian boys. I have some feeling for this because my dad, who just died this last year, served in the Navy in World War II. And at the age of 23, the Navy decided that he should be circumcised. He loved to describe that to me. But what the iconography seems to indicate is this is Christian blood down here at the bottom. The Christian boys are gesturing towards the holy, pure water of baptism. And the contrast, well, the contrast is just absolutely striking. It is, if one had to pick out, if I had to pick out one example of, illustrated example of vicious anti-Semitism from the medieval period, I would pick that particular illumination. In any case, and this is partially what I can't explain completely, these concilia were written all over the Mediterranean, and so it's not unusual to find a case that is dealing with France or Spain, a concilium written by an Italian jurist. But what you have before you is something that is a little bit different. This is a court case that took place in Naples. We don't know exactly the date, but it's a court case, as you can see, between a Jewish father who wants to get his son back and the court in Naples, and I have no understanding at all why the court in Naples would have jurisdiction. I mean, there were, of course, at this time connections between Naples and Spain and Portugal, but I really don't understand why this would be decided. But this court case gets cited time and time again by all the later jurists. And the is my mouse dying on me? Do I have another option? Oh, here we go. The reason that this particular court case became such an important court case is all the later jurists cited this court case to justify a Jewish child being taken from his parents, and the reasons are, well, the reasons are given. You can read them for yourself. But the important thing is, or I think the significance of this particular case is that there's a turning point. At least from the research that I've done so far, there's a turning point sometime between, say, 1450 and 1525. There's a turning point in the way in which the jurists looked at this particular problem. This is not to say that the medieval jurists, as I indicated to you, were models of virtue when it came to looking at this particular situation, but they were certainly much better than the 16th and 17th century jurists. Another very famous concilium that was written by a fairly obscure jurist, Petrus Paulus Parisius. He also dealt with a court case. Now he is writing in either Naples or Rome. It's not absolutely clear where he's writing this concilium, but he is also writing about the Portuguese case. Somebody from Portugal asked him about an opinion about what King Manuel I had done with the Jews and their children, and he wrote a very long concilium. It goes on, these are 10 folio pages that covers the entire legal status of the Jews from his point of view in the 16th century. And this illustration, you notice that the Jews are not caricatured here. This is another English manuscript, by the way. But it does another blood libel that the Jews were often accused of was to attack the host. And here you see two Jews attacking the holy host, and the host is bleeding, which means that the host was in complete conformity with current Catholic teaching, that it represented the body and blood of Christ. In any case, Parisius's concilium is particularly interesting because it's an example that not all jurists were swept away by the idea that the Jews had no rights over their children at all. And he dealt specifically with the case that Mateus de Afflictus, the case that we just looked at, and he says, I don't agree with it. My opinion is that the case was wrongly decided, but then he goes on to say, How could they come to that opinion? And he creates this fictional story about, well, the Jewish child was baptized, and then he never rejected his baptism, and so eventually it became a valid baptism. But the future, it seems, was much more dismal. The coerced baptisms of Jews went on into the 19th century. And the legal grounding, of these baptisms, I think, was twofold. First of all, the theological thought, at least this is just one example of a theologian from Belgium, the theological thought really became, there's no other way to describe it, just vicious, absolutely vicious. They simply, as you can read this theologian Aurelio Petit, just simply could not imagine how the Holy Father in Rome would permit Jews to live in the Papal States. And what is particularly significant about this is that Pope Benedict XIV, who is generally considered one of the great academic, intellectual popes of the early modern period, wrote then a long treatise dealing exactly with the issue of when it was justified to baptize Jewish children, which was a step back just by itself. But he wrote a long treatise, and I got this quotation out of Benedict's treatise on the coerced baptism of Jews because he cites this theologian, in fact he cites this exact quote, as being an example of how Jews were looked upon. And what Benedict says is, I want to straighten things out. I don't want this kind of thing to continue. And so Benedict then laid down a set of principles, that justified the coerced baptism of Jews. And you can see in these principles many resonances that stretch all the way back to Gratian in the 12th century, other developments as well. But if you go down the list, there are so many exceptions to the general rule that unwilling parents can be coerced into baptizing their children, that the exceptions, well, from a legal point of view, almost any coerced baptism would be considered in the time of Benedict in the Papal States to be a valid baptism. And I'll just end with a story that is fairly well known. In the 19th century, during the pontificate of Pius IX, this man, Edgardo Levi Mortara, was sick when he was a young boy. A Christian nanny was taking care of him. The Christian nanny baptized him because he was sick, and it was decided within the Papal States that this was a valid baptism. The Pope himself took Edgardo away. As you can see, Edgardo became a priest and in fact even came to the United States trying to proselytize Jews in New York City. He didn't get a very warm reception, but this question of the status of Jews and the coerced baptism of Jews had a very, very long history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken, for this, I can't say wonderful lecture because it's a rather disturbing lecture. I'm supposed to give a couple of comments to start up the discussion, and I will keep that very short to give you a lot of time to react on that. Usually the idea is to tie papers together, and I probably could do that in some witty way or another, and I'm not trying to do that because sometimes it's more productive to reflect on why do those papers, those two presentations, those two views into the medieval world do not really fit together. That might lead to more ideas. So I will talk first very briefly about Mary's paper, which I enjoyed a lot, especially her main thesis that those peace councils of the late 10th century are rooted not only in the Carolingian world, but also in the entire late antique, early medieval world. That of course speaks completely out of my heart because that's where I'm coming from. And I know this tendency of historians to first of all, naturally to defend their field of research and then to proclaim the new aspects of them and to deny that much of what they observe and they analyze has been around before. But I see that very clearly in different ways. So I see different elements. I see the religious enthusiasm, I'm sorry, in the cult of the saints, in the role of the saint as mediator and as an active part of those peace processes. I see this, talking about your ideas about focusing on the laity, I see these moments of blurring the boundary between a lay world, an aristocracy, a higher aristocracy, the bishops, see those moments when groups are working together in order to create a maybe more peaceful, more stable society, and somehow getting out of this structural tension between, on the one hand, representing their own families, and on the other hand, representing their belonging to a certain group or a party. I see that very clearly compared, for example, to the Merovingian period, to the early 7th century, when we had a short window in Frankish society where we had Columbanian monks, but also Columbanian kings and Columbanian bishops, and a Columbanian aristocracy that produced monks, abbots, bishops, and also lay people deeply influenced by this strange Irish wandering monk. I see this line, and I see, of course, the connections between those peace councils and the Carolingian reform councils, and it inspires me to actually to carry all that, what you described, back and to see what do we find of that in my 7th century Merovingian sources, or rereading the acts of the Carolingian councils and the Capitularia, which is of course basically the same kind of sources, and see, have I something missed that you worked out in your much later sources? So thank you very much for that inspiration, and maybe still to try to establish a link. What we see at those three moments, the 7th century, the Carolingian reform movement, and your period, what we may see is moments where there is something like politics going on, something that I don't see in the Western world since maybe 25 years, that people are really doing politics with the intention not to short-sight resolve problems, but to improve society, I turned that into a question. Was that really around in that period? Or is this sort of a thin level of propaganda covering pure self-interests of those different groups or family self-interests? Or can we turn it around and say that maybe this ideal of reform, this idea of creating some sort of an ideal Christian society was that there is a continuity and we just see the peaks and don't see the undercurrents unless we start really actively looking for that. So I'm not sure where on that continuum I should place myself, and that might be an interesting thing to discuss. And this idea of creating a society through those peace councils, that might be a link to the dark side as we see it in Kent's paper. And of course, the entire movement towards pressing the world into a legal framework and giving authority to legal experts who produced those briefs could also be imagined as a sort of a step towards a better society. And this is, of course, is totally broken down with your idea, your starting point, which is stronger in the long paper I read than in the short version you gave us. This idea of the violence of the law, and that this undermines, lately in the link of what Samantha said, this our openness and willingness to understand the Middle Ages in their own terms, and to open us up to this completely different yet fascinating world and to respect it. This is, of course, here we suddenly see the limits, and here we I think need to be appalled and need to see. I mean, you didn't mention in your paper Raymond de Peñafort, who I worked a little bit with in the context of pastoral care, and I started to admire. And now can I still admire him, seeing his standpoints on terrible things like the forced baptism of Jewish children. That's a tension we have to sort of endure as medieval historians, but you give it yet another twist in your longer paper, which was also for me a provocation to read, but I think a very healthy provocation, saying that this violence of the law, we can look at that in the past, but it's still going on, of course. And you used a very strong example, the situation of so-called illegal immigrants, and is it more violence of the law using the term illegal? You have suddenly not illegal acts, but you have illegal people. And you made this very provoking comparison between people without a legal status in the United States and Jews in the Middle Ages, which I had to slick, but I think it's a sort of a productive feeling of, can we do that? So opening the discussion with those thoughts. Who wants to start with questions?
I'll start off again. Just to get things moving. A couple comments about Professor Pennington's talk, but also, Albrecht, your comments. The difference between equating Jews in Europe, of course, with illegal or any immigrants in America is that, for instance, in Italy, Jews had been there since antiquity, and so they were a constant. They were actually part of the population. Even in the Rhineland, we have Jews in Cologne in the 4th century and probably continuous through the Carolingian period. So Jews were an other, but they were not outsiders. They were not new arrivals. So it's a different situation somewhat than but it is about identity and something that we have today. I want to address 2 points in Professor Pennington's fascinating talk. Just one about the iconography. In the Rhineland, you also have depictions of Jews which are rather grotesque caricatures, along with England. But England is particularly vicious in its depictions. in part, especially even when you have the absence of Jews. And there's this correlation where you have the longer presence of Jews and the more integrated they are in society, like in Italy and even in Spain, you have the less grotesque representations because they are more commonplace. They haven't been demonized. They're not an idea, they're a reality. But the further they are from the everyday life of the place, then the more prone they are to be caricatured. The second point is just about King Manuel in Portugal and the forced baptism there. And I don't know the answers, but it's a complex situation because there he was baptizing everybody, Jews and children, because he didn't want to expel them. He wanted to keep them in the country for economic reasons. He thought the Spanish had been foolish to expel them, and he had taken in as many Jews as he could. So what he was doing, he was creating them, made them de facto Christians, but he gave them 5 or 10, I forget how many years, even a generation, before they had to fully adopt. But it made them, by making them Christians, their descendants could be victims of the Inquisition. But if they were Jews, they essentially would be free of the Inquisition. And I wonder whether some of that might play into the attention to those baptisms, because whether these people could be prosecuted as Jews or Christians would affect a lot of the outcome and also the economic, and there's a lot of wealth involved in with this population too.
Your first point. The first point, I would just make the point that up until the nation state of the 19th century started insisting on passports, anybody could go anywhere. They had a right. The lawyers said they had a jus naturale. They had a natural right to go. Every human being had a natural right to go everywhere that they wanted to go. So my point would simply be, whether Jews have been there a long time or whether illegal immigrants in this country have been here a relatively short time, I would argue, remember I'm a medievalist, they have every right to be here, as much right as you and I have to be here. The second point, I mean, I agree, there's a difference if there's a native population. Well, no, I mean, but up until the 19th century, your right to live in a particular place was not how long you had been there.
Yes, absolutely.
And that, by the way, goes back to pagan Roman law.
But your reaction, your relations with the people around you would depend on that.
Right.
For generations, you have a different status than you.
Right. The second point, if you go over the illuminations I showed you, most of those are from before the expulsion of the Jews. Most of those caricatures and the Rhineland examples that I think you're citing, are woodcuts that are really crude woodcuts. No. I haven't seen any really good late German illuminations that are caricatures, but you'll have to tell me about them. And then your third point. Oh, the money. I know that Portuguese historians, for example, the ones that I cited there, sort of defend, in a sense, they're defending King Manuel by saying he had economic reasons for keeping him there. I really doubt that. I think he was one vicious human being. And I think that I would really like, I've gotten in contact with a number of Portuguese historians. There must be a legal literature, because we know that he asked for juristic opinions about his edict in 1496, 1497. I haven't been able to find any, and none of the Portuguese historians, both whom I've cited as well as others, have been able to tell me if there are any. But I think that what Manuel did in his juris is he took the darker side of the legal tradition and he used it for his own purposes. Well, I'm not an economic historian, so I'm not really persuaded by economic arguments.
What I always heard was basically the Jews are there at the port. You know, the Tower of Berlin is right there. They're ready to go in their ships, and they can't go. And they're baptized. They were forced to be baptized at the time. They're sprinkling holy water on the
You've got the story right.
Right. So the point is, why did he do that? Did he not want them to go for his own advantage, or did he not want? So I'm just saying that there was more at play than kind of just a viciousness to get to children to make them Christian. There was another motive there, and for centuries, I mean, the common literature said, you know, essentially he was getting economic advantage. He got all these trained professionals, such as artisans and others, who came from Spain, and he was holding. He couldn't hold them very long, but in the end, he had to.
Yeah, and there were many Portuguese Jews that got away. The article that I cited on one of the pages by Cafiero is an excellent article about Portuguese Jews who ended up in Italy and weren't very happy about being in Italy. They were crazy, of course. Who isn't happy being in Italy?
I'd just like to ask you to tell us more about the legal status of concilia. It seems to me that they're just somebody's opinion and don't have authority by virtue of being a concilium.
This is the best question that anyone could possibly ask me, is what is the legal status of concilia in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries? Before the 14th century, the major literature, I feel as if I'm going into a lecture. The major literature in law were legal commentaries. And then suddenly, beginning at the second half of the 13th century, lawyers found out that they could make money by writing essentially opinions, as I said in my talk, for either the court or for the litigants. So they're ex parte opinions. But whether they were important at the time, what happens from the first half of the 14th century on, and if you go into any good law library in Europe, there are volume after volume after volume of printed concilia, and there are even more volumes of manuscript concilia. And the printed concilia prove my point exactly. There are literally thousands of printed volumes of concilia. And why did the printers in the 15th and, well, late 15th and 16th and 17th century continue printing these? Is because they became authoritative texts. They were dealing with, as all of those, well, not all of them, I only showed you about 5, but as those concilia that I showed you, they became authoritative texts that then other jurists used again and again and again. I indicated that in my talk, that the Mateus de Afflictus and also the Parisius concilia were cited after again and again and again. So that the answer, the short answer is, they became authoritative texts, even though they were just the opinions. I mean, they didn't, from the point of view of American law, they were about as authoritative as a professor's law review article. But in the context, in the legal context of the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, they were enormously authoritative and were cited constantly.
Thank you. I'm just appalled and shaken by how very long this attitude, I mean, I'm a medievalist, so, you know, I know this stuff in the Middle Ages, but this attitude and actions toward the Jews endured. I mean, these dates of this Pope here, I mean, just terribly surprised me. Has there been an absolute condemnation? Has there been statement in canon law? Has there been something papal that, in fact, decries this, damns it outright? Give me a Pope I can love.
Well, every religion has its tradition, its dark side.
I'm pretty sure John Fraser, Stephen Kurtz's book, The Kidnapping of the Garden, Stephen Kurtz's book. A book by Stephen Kurtzner will answer your question. I can't give you the answer. I know John the 23rd had said things, but I think even before. But Stephen Kurtzner's book, The Kidnapping of Edgardo Murtura, will answer your question. I don't know the specific answer, but I think there have been, I mean, but if you go to Rome or Venice, you see the houses of the catechumens. These were the houses where these Jewish children would be taken.
Right, but the question was, does any pope apologize for
Yes,
what he
I'm
described?
sure, but I don't know which one.
I don't think any pope has. There have been apologies for the treatment of the Jews in general.
I think the last pope.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay.
John JP too apologized for the treatment of Jews in general.
Well, Ken, first, welcome back. And hello, Marlene, and hello, Jay. I'm glad you could all come today. I guess I had a question. I don't know if you can answer it, though, Ken. It's about the...
This shows a lot of confidence.
Yeah, I know. It's about the caricature of the face. I mean, one of the things that's happened since you left the department is that physiognomy and phrenology have become the rage in our department.
Oh,
and
really?
Yeah. It's something.
Well, how could that be with, I mean, you're all such good-looking professors and beautiful professors.
It's a true Pennington moment here. Well, it's more what people study than actually their relation to the mirror. But anyway, let me just ask my question, because what I guess I don't understand is how those facial features were understood. I mean, whether they were, described differently in England than elsewhere. Was there an understanding that there were a set of characteristics that went along with those features, or did the features grow from people acting a certain way? I mean, I look, for instance, at the photograph of Edgardo Levi Mortara. I mean, is it because he doesn't act Jewish that he doesn't look Jewish? Is that how it was understood? Or, I'm just trying to understand what that phrenology was about.
The art, I can just say the art historians that I listed in one of the first pages of my presentation are enormously unhelpful in answering that question. It's your fault.
I'm not one of those. Hi, Meredith, please correct me if you think my answer is wrong. So I am an art historian, so I'm going to try to address that issue. Not the answer. I would say that kind of grotesque facial depictions are not limited to the Jews. That's the first thing I would say. I've seen it in, you have to go to the conventions of medieval depiction of moral values. So a face that is deformed, that is gesturing very violently, and that's something that can always be better expressed in profile than in a frontal view. That implies some moral deficiency, either because of religious belief or whatever. So if you look at any of the people who are committing, punishing the martyrs, and obviously they were not Jews, they were identified as Roman pagans, they look like the Jews, if you want. The Jews have this hat, and then when you have the hat, they are exactly the Jews. But because the Jews were seen as bad, as bad people, to speak it quickly, they will be depicted with these grotesque faces. But anyone who was bad will have those faces. Is a convention to explain. So they have a big nose because it's a matter of what is beautiful according to the old classical aesthetics and what is ugly. So it's a matter of proportions. It's a matter of what I call a Botox face. It will be very beautiful as someone very good. But if you just even smile, if you show your teeth, that's an act of aggression. they all have a nose that is proportioned in certain ways. So that's the way, at least, I always understood it. And I teach it to my students. I hope I'm right.
Can I just say,
Sure.
Can I just say that all of those illustrations that we have of Jews, I paged through all of them. And for the most part, in most, particularly in 13th and 14th century illuminations, Jews are quite beautiful, aren't they? Quite beautiful. You can't distinguish them physiologically from.
That's why they needed the badge, actually. Legally, that's why.
Well, they would have their hats on, or they would, but they weren't caricatured.
Well, it depends on talking early medieval Romanesque. I'm thinking Romanesque, which is more.
No, I'm not claiming any expertise. It's just for this little talk, I did a fair amount of looking, and I was just struck that I could only find these really severe caricatures in English manuscripts.
But that's because they're better studied and more published. I wouldn't take it as
I can give you some French examples.
Yeah.
Lovely French examples.
You can look anywhere and you see them.
Yeah, I've just got a couple of points toward a question. I'm not going to ask the question. I think you and Pachter are absolutely right. That right up until the early 13th century, I think it's probably the evidence of secret Judaeus that in canon law. That's pretty firm, and that seems to have held off the kind of thing that comes just after 4 Lateran or 1250 or so. As I remember it, Canon 68, give or take a canon of 4 Lateran, because I can't remember the exact one, says that Jews must wear, and Muslims must wear distinguishing signs on their clothing, because this is true in certain parts of Christendom, and now we are making it standard for all of Christendom, because Christians cannot tell the difference. Not just Jews, but Muslims. Less Christian women marry Jewish men and vice versa and all this. We cannot tell the difference, and that's 1215. And that's a pretty carefully considered bunch of canons. And so you've got a starting date. You get to the end of this, and what happened to Pio Nono is that he ran into the late 19th century equivalent of Facebook. That case was so well known and so well publicized that every pope after him had to shut up, because you just can't do that anymore. People know. There you've got 2 photographs. And this was all over Europe. And especially it was over Christian Europe that was partly Protestant. And the United States went crazy with it. Henry Charles Lee had told a story that his family thought that when he was a very small boy, his Irish Catholic nurse had sneaked him off to a Catholic church in Philadelphia and had him baptized. And they brushed it off, because in the US, of course, you could. The Catholic Church was a mission church. It didn't matter what they said. No legal standing. Well, that was the start of it.
I'm not sure this is a question, but it seems to me that one of the things that the 2 papers have in common is the way in which law can be used, and often is used, to define a community and then to exclude people from it. So that in Mary's paper, there is partly this effort in the peace councils to define who should not be attacked with impunity, even by the people whose job is to attack people and things, and generally to wage war. That their job to wage war should nevertheless be limited to people who are not part of their own community. And that the peasants, for example, they might wish to identify as excluded from the community and therefore legal, legitimate victims of violence, but they're being told not. And the law in this other context is used to define a community such that some people are excluded from it and therefore subject to practices that would be considered barbaric if inflicted within the community. So I'm not sure where the question is, but it does strike me that there are some things that the 2 papers share about how the law can be very, very dark, that it can be used precisely to exclude people and to make them legitimate targets of very disturbing practices, or to protect them.
I think you're right. The solidarity, you built up solidarity within the community to exclude others. But there was another thing that I think brought the papers together, perhaps, and that is that the law can also be used to persecute those within the community. was a great deal made in my literature of those reservations and the fact that the law could be used by people who had allodial property and had peasants on their lands. They were not even touched by the peace of God because they were the lords of those domains and could do what they wanted with their own peasants. It was only the peasants outside. So I think it worked both ways. So in a little bit it was something like the canon law, but not looking at the Jews and looking at obvious outsiders, but also what about couldn't similar law be used against Christians in somewhat similar ways?
Well, heretics.
Yes, good.
Well, heretics. And in fact, one of the things that the jurists did as time went on is they applied the rules of heretics, particularly if you harbored a heretic, you could be condemned as a heretic. And they did the same thing to Jews. Any Jew who harbored a convertiti who had relapsed could be convicted by inquisitorial courts just as a Christian heretic could be.
I could add something. I mean, there were heretics also in 1030 in Orleans at about the same time of the peace movement, and I didn't get into that, but there are lots of efforts to connect the peace movement somehow with the persecution of these first, perhaps Cathari, but probably just people, lay people trying to live an apostolic life that became the targets of the law.
I'd like to continue to pursue this question about Jews and Inquisition, but I had another one in my mind. I'm going to drag it back to Jim Jones' question, which you welcome, so you wouldn't mind a somewhat snide after question.
You have to be kind to them.
What did you mean by concilia being authoritative? It seemed to me that what you proved really that they were very influential, and the fact that I mean, you said a Harvard Law review, an article in the Harvard Law Review. Well, that kind of material is cited before the Supreme Court and other courts all the time. It doesn't make it authoritative, and it could even appear and does appear in a Supreme Court judgment. I remember that as regards the brief to the Supreme Court, you and me were cited once. That doesn't make us authoritative.
We were both cited in a Supreme Court decision, but on the losing side.
But be proud. In what sense were they authoritative? In any strict sense?
Well, I said before that one of the proofs, I would argue, that they were authoritative is the fact that 14th and 15th century jurists were printed and printed again and again. That is to say, their concilia were printed and printed again by printers in the 16th and 17th century. But more than that, if you read commentaries, legal commentaries, treatises in the 16th and 17th centuries, these concilia are cited again and again. Now, maybe your word influential is much better than my word authoritative. I concede that it could be influential, but that they shape legal reasoning. I mean, for example, the idea first surfaces with Guido de Basio that Jews had the same legal status as slaves. And it sort of disappears. And then suddenly it pops up, particularly in connection with Portugal. It pops up in the 16th century, and that's what I find particularly fascinating about law and the way in which it evolves. It isn't one straight path to the truth. And so you're right. I mean, it isn't authoritative in the way in which a Supreme Court decision is authoritative, but it has a great deal of weight, I think.
I think we needn't go on disputing because we really have reached agreement now, in a sense. There are two senses of the word authoritative. I mean, some academic's opinion, which commands enormous weight among his fellows, is, if you want to call it, authoritative. But it's, while you were speaking, I was thinking of the glossa ordinaria to the decretum. That was printed over and over and over again. Well, it's authoritative in that schools accepted it as a general tool for teaching, the best thing available. Not authoritative in the sense that it has legal authority, but just a distinction.
I agree.
I think we have two more questions. No, okay then.
I've already had somebody else.
No, I saw you, and then I'll
just to take this question and tie it to the Jewish discussion, the equivalent, not exact equivalent in the Jewish tradition to the concilium is the responsa literature, which are the opinions of rabbis over centuries and centuries and centuries. And these were originally in manuscript, and then they, starting in the late 15th and particularly in the 16th century, they became printed, some of them. And some of them are authoritative and some of them are influential. But they cover a wide range of things and issues, but they are responsive to particular places and times and situations because they always deal, as your documents do, with actual cases. So what happens is that over the centuries, some become more popular as new issues arise that relate to those old cases, so they're resurrected. Today, though, it's all computerized. So a friend of mine who's an art historian, a colleague, was doing research on, she wanted responsive literature about synagogue architecture. So she went to the computerized database at Bar-Ilan University and she said, I'd like responsive literature about this issue. And they said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, can't you just give me all the responsa? And they said, well, that's not the way we work. Usually people come to us with a question and they know what the answer is that they want, and then they ask us, give us all the precedent, all the responsa that will support my position. And in that way, maybe the concilium are both authoritative and influential, but they are not universally accepted by everyone.
Just one more comment. I hope you've seen this cartoon. I didn't, in a longer version of the talk, I was going to include this cartoon. And this is the view of us from south of the border.
One more question.
I'm wondering whether you should make a distinction between the Catholic Church and de facto what Catholic Christians do. I mean, if you cite me a view that comes from the decretals of the Pope or decisions of church councils, to me you could say they represent the Catholic Church. But when you cite an opinion of a legal scholar who just says this is my view about something, that does not seem to me that you can attribute it to the Catholic Church. You can attribute it to Catholics. There is, I'm wondering what the authority of a legal scholar has against the authority of a Catholic theologian. And I'd like to cite Thomas Aquinas, who asked the question that you asked, should or can or should Jewish children with their parents unwilling be baptized? And he very unequivocally says, no, they should not. Now, he can't speak for the church. There are other masters of theology who maybe disagree with him. But he certainly has some authority. And he's not just anybody. And he will have great influence as well. And just how you play canon
right. Well, first of all, Thomas's opinion was cited again and again and again and again. Thomas's opinion was rejected, however, as well. The question of who speaks for the Catholic Church, I think of the people I cited, the only one I could say securely speaking for the Catholic Church was Benedict XIV. He issued what, I didn't go into detail, but when he wrote this treatise on 4 coerced baptisms, he used an example of a forced baptism, and then he said, there's so many of them in Rome and in the Papal States, I'm going to write a treatise on how this should be handled. So of all the people that I talked about today and people that I didn't talk about today, I think the only, there are 2 papal documents that I can, there might be a third, no, there are 3 or 4 papal documents, either papal decretals from the 13th and 14th centuries, or Benedict's declaration. No, I think that's it. There are papal decretals would be the papal curia, at least, if not the Pope himself, and then Benedict's treatise on the issue. But the rest of them, as you say, are not. Thomas Aquinas doesn't represent the Catholic Church.
Wasn't he though adopted as the theologian of the Catholic Church? Mm-hmm. And so he does in some sense. And I don't know if it's pertinent, but when you're saying what you are, I'm thinking of how in the 14th century there was the great divide between conciliarism and papism, just as there is now. And with Vatican II, you know, we are the people, we are the church. What we say is inspired as much as that which is papal. You know, the whole business of infallibility, although it was thought about and talked about early on, wasn't really declared dogmatic until the 19th century. Somebody knows that? Yeah, okay. So this, I think, is all somehow relevant to how authoritative all of those things are.
Short response from your side, and then we are going to have coffee.
Most of you know, but Brian Tierney is my mentor, has been for 50 years. It's disgusting.
40 so.
40. In any case, he wrote the book on papal infallibility, so maybe over coffee.
I'm sorry, I spoke.
Okay, we all deserve a break now. I think we're going to start at about 4:20 and continue then with Professor Constable's lecture. So.